The moon had no military base. That was the first thing anyone would tell you about Kepler's Reach. No weapons platform hanging in orbit. No fighter wing ready on a runway. No defense grid buried under the ice, waiting for a war that everyone said would never come this far out. The Galactic Concordat had kept the peace for 200 years. There was no reason to worry. There was no reason to build guns on a moon that grew tomatoes. What Kepler's Reach had instead was a greenhouse district that stretched 40 kilometers across the dark side of the moon, glowing faint orange under the gas giant Absalom's reflected light. Third-generation settlers had pressed their hands into frozen soil and learned slowly, painfully, stubbornly, how to make things grow where nothing was supposed to grow. They had failed 100 times. They had tried again 101. By the time the colony hit its 40th year, Kepler's Reach was exporting fresh produce to 6 other settlements in the system, and the people who had built that were quietly, fiercely proud in the way that people only get when they have earned something the hard way. There was a school with 847 children enrolled. The older kids helped the younger ones with math on Tuesday afternoons, because the teacher, a man named Obasi, had found that teaching each other worked better than listening to him. There was a hospital with 12 doctors and one exhausted surgeon named Dr. Patel who hadn't taken a vacation in 4 years and kept meaning to. There was a market on Tuesday mornings where a woman named Hessa sold hand-knitted gloves from a folding table because the heating in the residential block never quite worked right, and the cold always seeped through the walls before winter ended. There were 840,000 people. On the night the Veth Karal came, a girl named Sana was recording a birthday message for her grandmother back on Earth. She was 9 years old. She sat in front of the family's communication terminal in her pajamas, the ones with the small yellow stars on them, and she held up a drawing she had made of a horse, because her grandmother had told her once that she missed horses more than anything about the old world. "This is for you," Sana said, holding up the drawing. "I made the tail too long, but I think it looks nice anyway." She was still talking when the transmission cut. The timestamp read 14 seconds before the Veth Karal fleet dropped out of fold space above Kepler's Reach. The night operator at the colony's communication tower was a young man named Teo. He was 23 years old, 1 year into the job, and he had spent most of the quiet overnight shifts reading old detective novels on his datapad. He was 2 chapters from the end of a particularly good one when the long-range sensor array lit up like something had set it on fire. 12 contacts, appearing from nothing, right there on the edge of the moon's gravity well. Teo set his book down. He looked at the readout for a long time. The contacts were not human ships. The configuration was wrong, too wide at the back. Weapons arrays placed in positions that no human designer would choose. He had been trained to recognize Veth Karal signatures from his very first week on the job. It was considered the kind of thing you put in a training manual more for completeness than anything else. The Veth Karal were a Concordat member. They had their space, and humans had theirs, and the two had coexisted without incident for 61 years. Teo's hands were shaking when he triggered the emergency broadcast. The alarm went out to every speaker on Kepler's Reach at 0314 local time. People woke up confused, then scared. Parents picked up children. People ran for shelter protocols they had practiced once a year and never expected to use. Dr. Patel was already awake. He was always awake, and he started moving people toward the hospital's lower levels before anyone had officially told him what was happening. Hessa left her apartment with nothing but her coat and her daughter's hand. Obasi, the teacher, called every family in his records and told them to get underground. The Veth Karal fleet held position for exactly 9 minutes. No communication, no signal of any kind, no demand, no warning, no ultimatum, nothing. They did not ask for anything. They did not offer anything. They simply held position above the moon. 12 warships carrying weapons that had been built to fight other warships, pointing those weapons at a settlement of 840,000 people who had no weapons of their own. Then the first kinetic rod entered the atmosphere. The thing about a kinetic bombardment is that it is very simple. There is no explosion to prepare for, no flash of light that gives you a half-second of warning. A kinetic rod is just mass, dropped from space, accelerated by gravity until it hits the ground with the energy of a small nuclear weapon. When it lands, it does not burn. It simply erases the thing that was there. The greenhouse district was gone in 11 minutes. The market square where Hessa's folding table sat empty with the gloves still laid out on it went 4 minutes after that. The hospital took a direct hit at 0341. Dr. Patel had gotten 200 people into the lower levels. He was in the corridor trying to get 200 more when the ceiling came down. The school had been empty. Obazi had done his job. He felt, in his last minutes, that this was the only thing that mattered. The bombardment lasted 4 hours and 7 minutes. The Veth-Karal fleet never moved from its position, never came closer, never sent a single transmission to the colony below or to any other human vessel in the system. Their logs recovered much later, under circumstances no one in the Concordat had anticipated, contained a single line from the Veth-Karal fleet commander, written at 0313, 1 minute before the alarm went out. It read, "Proceeding with discouragement action. Estimated time to completion, 4 hours. Colony expected to abandon the site within 30 days. Not an act of war, not a military engagement, not even, by the Veth-Karal's own accounting, a notable event. HFY discouragement action, because Kepler's Reach sat on a piece of space they had decided they wanted. Because moving 840,000 people out of the way was simpler than negotiating. Because humanity was a quiet, unremarkable species that had never pushed back against anything, and the Veth-Karal had done this before to smaller, weaker species, and it had always worked. They did not consider, for even a moment, that it might not work this time. The cargo hauler Times, Inelegant Persistence Times, was docked at the colony's secondary port when the alarm went out. It was not a fast ship. It was not a graceful ship. It was the kind of ship that made engineers wince and accountants smile, ugly and efficient, and built to carry a great deal of weight across long distances without spending too much on fuel. Its captain, Commander Yara Ose, had owned it for 11 years and loved it the way you love a thing that has never once failed you when it mattered. She was on the bridge before the second alarm cycle finished. Her crew of 9 was right behind her. She had 118 minutes between the first alarm and the moment the Veth-Karal fleet would have a firing solution on a ship at the secondary port. She knew this because she had run the numbers in her head in the time it took her to get dressed, and Yara Ose's head for numbers had never been wrong about anything practical. She opened every channel she had. "This is Commander Yara Ose of the Times Inelegant Persistence, docked at Kepler's Reach secondary port. We are loading survivors. Anyone who can move, come to the port. Anyone who can hear this and has a ship, get to the port. I am not leaving until I have to." And she loaded 1,108 people onto a ship built to carry cargo. She put children in the cargo holds, in the maintenance corridors, in every space that had air and room to sit. Her crew moved people like they were moving something precious, because they were, because every person who came through that door was a person she could carry out of this. Her engineer, a quiet man named Dao, picked up 2 children who were too small to climb the ramp and carried them on board himself without saying a word. Her first mate, Rina, stayed at the base of the ramp until the very last possible second, counting heads, looking back down the corridor for anyone still coming. At 116 minutes, Yara Ose lifted off. She could not save everyone. She knew that. She could hear what was happening to the colony from the sensor. Feeds the sounds that kinetic impacts make when you are close enough to feel them in the hull. She kept her face still. Her crew kept their faces still. The 1,108 people packed into every corner of the Times. Inelegant. Persistence Times were very quiet, in the way that people get quiet when they are trying to hold themselves together. She pointed the ship at the nearest relay buoy and ran. The Veth-Karal fleet saw her immediately. Of course they did. She was not invisible. She was, in fact, one of the least invisible ships in the system. Large, slow, radiating heat from every vent, because she was carrying 4 times her intended capacity, and the life support was working at maximum. She had 18 minutes before they could get a clean intercept. She used every one of them. Her hands moved across her console without hesitation. She uploaded everything: sensor logs, ship identification codes, the exact configuration of the Veth-Karal fleet, weapon yield estimates from the impact data, timestamps, coordinates, everything. She packaged it and sent it to the relay buoy, which bounced it to the next buoy, which bounced it further, outward through the relay chain toward human space. She recorded a voice note with it. Her name, her ship name, the colony's name, what had happened, what the Veth Karal had done, and why every piece of data she had sent was accurate and could be trusted. She did all of this in a clear, steady voice. She was not calm. Anyone who knew Yara Ose well enough to look closely would have seen that her jaw was tight, and her hands, moving efficiently across the console, had a slight tremor she was choosing not to acknowledge. But her voice was clear. Her data was accurate. She understood what the information was worth, and she understood what she was doing with her last useful minutes, and she was going to do it right. The data packet hit the relay buoy with 40 seconds to spare. The Veth Karal intercept came 9 seconds later. The times inelegant persistence times ugly, efficient, beloved, and carrying 1,108 people who had not yet understood what they had survived, went dark. The 1,108 people lived. The relay buoy did not, but the data was already gone. The Galactic Concordat convened an emergency session 14 hours after the bombardment of Kepler's Reach. The chamber held representatives from 34 species, and it was full. Every seat was taken. The air had the particular quality of a room where everyone knows something terrible has happened and no one is quite sure what to say about it. 17 species gave statements. The Thari Collective expressed profound sorrow and called for a full investigation. The Saurian Compact offered humanitarian assistance to displaced survivors. The Methoran Federation called for calm and measured response. The Duer spoke for 40 minutes about the importance of dialogue. The Veth Karal ambassador, a long-limbed creature named Velsoth who had been in the Concordat chamber for 30 years, sat with its hands folded and said that the action at Kepler's Reach had been a regrettable misunderstanding and that his government was prepared to discuss reparations in the appropriate forum. 17 species spoke. 1 proposed a committee. 2 proposed a subcommittee. 1 proposed a committee to decide whether a subcommittee was appropriate. The human ambassador, Director General Sujin Bei, did not speak. She sat at the human delegations table, and she listened to every word. She was a small woman with short gray hair, and the posture of someone who had long ago decided that appearing relaxed was a tool, not an accident. She had been in the Concordat chamber for 16 years. She had heard a great deal of talking in those 16 years, and she had learned that most of it was the sound that intelligent creatures made when they wanted to feel like they were doing something without actually doing anything. She was not angry. Or rather, she was something past anger, something that had moved through anger and come out the other side into a colder, quieter place that had no common name. She listened until the session chair asked if the human delegation had a statement. Sujin Bei looked at the chair. She looked at the Veth Karal ambassador. She looked at the 17 species who had spoken, at the committee proposal sitting in the session record, at the entire careful diplomatic machinery of the Galactic Concordat that had watched a colony of 840,000 people get erased and responded by scheduling a meeting. She said, "Thank you. The human delegation will respond in due course." She closed her session terminal. She picked up a different communication device, a small, encrypted handset that was not connected to any Concordat channel. She pressed it to her ear. She was already walking out of the chamber as it connected. The call she made on that handset was not to another diplomat. On the other end of the line, in a building on Earth that had no name on its exterior, a room full of people had been awake for 14 hours, waiting. When the call connected and they heard Sujin Bei's voice, they did not ask what she wanted. They already knew. They had known since the relay data came through, since the first sensor logs from Yara Ose's transmission had landed on their screens, and they had read the numbers and looked at each other in the particular silence of people who have just been handed something irreversible. Sujin Bei said 4 words. The room started moving. In the Concordat chamber behind her, 17 species were still talking. The Veth Karal ambassador was, at that exact moment, suggesting a timeline for the reparations discussion. A subcommittee was being proposed to establish the parameters of the committee that would oversee the investigation. Outside, in the long corridor of the Concordat building, Sujin Bei walked toward the exit at a pace that did not look like urgency but covered ground very quickly. Her aide had to take 2 steps for every one of hers to keep up. He had worked with her for 6 years, and he knew her well enough to understand that the stillness on her face right now was not calm. It was the face she made when a decision had already been made. and what remained was only the work. The work, in this case, was going to take some time, but not as much time as the Vethkaral were expecting. That was the thing they did not know yet. That was the thing of all the things they had failed to understand about the quiet, unremarkable species whose colony they had erased that would matter most in the end. Humanity was already moving. It had been moving, in certain quiet ways, for a very long time. The document was 2 pages long. That was the first thing that surprised Velsoth, the Vethkaral ambassador to the Galactic Concordat. He had been in diplomatic circles for 30 years. He had seen treaty documents that ran to 800 pages. He had seen counter-proposals, formal objections, grievance filings, and territorial dispute records that filled entire archive rooms. When the human delegation finally responded 11 days after the session where Director General Sujin Bey had said thank you and walked out, Velsoth had expected something lengthy. He received 2 pages. They were written in standard Concordat diplomatic script, which was the expected format, but the title had also been translated into Vethkaral ceremonial script, the old formal language, the one used in their most ancient legal and religious texts. Nobody outside the Vethkaral used ceremonial script. Nobody outside their species even studied it. That a human diplomat had not only found a translator but chosen to use that specific register, the register reserved for their most serious and binding declarations, was a detail so precisely aimed that Velsoth felt it land like a small cold weight in the center of his chest. The title read, Accounting, Notice Outstanding Debt. 840,000 souls plus 1. He read the 2 pages 3 times. The document did not ask for reparations. It did not request a formal Concordat investigation. It did not propose arbitration or suggest a timetable for diplomatic resolution. It did not use the language of grievance at all, not once. What it used instead was the language of accounting, simple, precise, without emotion. A debt had been incurred. The nature of the debt was described in 4 sentences. The party responsible for the debt was named. And then, the document outlined, in the same plain accounting language, that the human government was granting a period of 90 standard days for all Vethkaral military and civilian personnel to withdraw from what the document called the Zone of Resolution, F. It did not define what the Zone of Resolution was. That was the second thing that unsettled Velsoth. At the bottom of the second page, below the Director General's signature, there was a single additional line. It was not in diplomatic language. It was not in ceremonial script. It was written in plain common tongue, the language every species in the Concordat used in ordinary conversation. It read, The clock is running. Velsoth sent the document to his government's capital immediately. He included his own assessment, which was thorough and professional. He noted the unusual choice of ceremonial script. He flagged the Zone of Resolution language as potentially significant. He recommended that the government take the 90-day withdrawal period seriously, as a gesture of good faith, if nothing else. His government's response came back in 6 hours. It told him that humanity's response had been reviewed at the highest levels, and that the consensus was clear. The document was a piece of political theater, designed for internal human consumption. The Vethkaral Grand Council had evaluated the human military on record, and found it insufficient for any credible, large-scale engagement. The withdrawal recommendation was declined. Velsoth was instructed to continue in his current role and to await further developments. The message ended by noting that the Grand Council found the 2-page format somewhat amusing. Velsoth filed the response in his records. He sat at his desk for a long time after that, looking at nothing in particular. He had spent 30 years reading people, all kinds of people, from all kinds of species, and he had developed, over those 30 years, a reliable sense for when something was being underestimated. He sent one more personal message to his family on the Vethkaral homeworld. He suggested, gently, that they might want to visit relatives in the outer territories for a while. The thing about human space was that most of it looked the same from the outside. Ships moved, stations processed cargo, mining operations worked the asteroid belts, fuel depots ran their regular transfer cycles, orbital fabrication rings turned out components on the same schedules they always had. From any external observation point, from a Concordat monitoring satellite, from a passing trade vessel, From any of the quiet listening posts that every major species maintained near their neighbors' borders, human space looked like what it always looked like: busy, productive, unremarkable. What the outside observers could not see was the shift that happened on day 3 of the 90-day period, in a building on Earth with no name on the outside. The building sat in a mountain range that most people on Earth didn't visit. It had been there for 40 years. On the surface, in the records that anyone could access, it was listed as a logistics coordination facility. This was technically accurate. It was, in fact, the most important logistics coordination facility in human space, the nerve center of a supply and mobilization network that had been quietly built, expanded, and maintained for decades, for reasons that the people who built it had never wanted to explain out loud. The people inside that building began making calls. The calls went out to fabrication ring commanders across 23 star systems. They went to fuel depot administrators on 11 transit corridors. They went to the commanders of storage facilities, large, unremarkable structures parked at stable orbital points around uninhabited moons, whose manifest records listed their contents as reserve materiel in the driest possible bureaucratic language. Reserve materiel. 900,000 warships. They had been built over 20 years. Not all at once that would have been noticed. A few here, a few there. Construction spread across dozens of facilities. The components manufactured separately and assembled quietly. The finished ships mothballed in those unremarkable storage facilities, kept in low-power standby mode, their ammunition preloaded, their systems updated on a regular maintenance cycle, by rotating crews who knew exactly what they were maintaining and why, and never talked about it outside their clearance level. The human government had never announced this fleet, had never discussed it in any Concordat session, had never referenced it in any treaty document or diplomatic filing. They had simply built it. The way they built everything methodically, patiently, with a long view towards something they hoped would never be necessary. The storage facilities began opening. On the outside, it still looked like ordinary traffic. On day 9, a Concordat monitoring satellite near the edge of human space flagged unusual energy readings from a cluster of orbital structures near a moon called Hesper's Point. The satellite was automated and its alert went to a review queue that was checked by an analyst at the Concordat Intelligence Sharing Bureau, a Saurian named Tila, who was thorough and good at her job. She looked at the energy readings. She cross-referenced them against the known function of the structures in question. The structures were listed as storage. The energy output was consistent with, she checked her reference tables, with a very large number of ships powering up their systems simultaneously. She flagged it for escalation. She included a note that the numbers seemed unusual. Her supervisor looked at it and told her the numbers were probably a sensor error. On day 14, 3 more satellites filed similar reports. Different locations, same pattern, storage structures, unusual energy readings, traffic, moving outward. On day 21, a trade vessel passing through the Keller Transit Corridor reported something strange to its company's dispatch office. A column of warships, traveling in tight formation, that had taken 40 minutes to pass. The pilot had counted what he could, and then stopped counting. His dispatch forwarded the report to the Concordat Traffic Management Office, which forwarded it to the Intelligence Sharing Bureau, which flagged it as requiring investigation. The investigation was scheduled for the following week. On day 30, Velsoth sent another message to his government. This one was longer than his previous one. He included the satellite reports, the trade vessel account, and 3 other pieces of information he had quietly gathered through his own channels. He told his government that the pattern was consistent with a mobilization event of significant scale, and that he strongly recommended a reassessment of their earlier position. His government told him that the Veth-Karal border fleet had been reinforced as a precautionary measure, and that his concerns were noted. The border fleet reinforcement was 2,000 additional warships, bringing the total to 6,000. The Grand Council was satisfied that this represented an adequate deterrent. The human government, they reasoned, would see the reinforced border, understand that their political theater had failed to produce the desired psychological effect, and return to the Concordat table to negotiate properly. This was not an unreasonable position if you looked at it from a certain angle. The angle, specifically, where you had not yet seen the rest of what was coming. On day 61, The Concordat Intelligence Sharing Bureau sent an urgent communication to all member governments. It was unusual for the Bureau to send urgent communications. They were, by institutional nature, a careful and measured organization. They confirmed things before they said them. They checked their numbers. They ran their analyses through multiple review cycles before releasing them. The communication said, simply, that Bureau monitoring assets had recorded significant military mobilization activity in human space, and that member governments were advised to review the attached data. The attached data was 63 pages long. Velsoth read all 63 pages in one sitting. When he finished, he sat very still for a moment. Then he poured himself a drink, something he rarely did during working hours, and read the summary section again. He sent a message to his government. This time, he did not recommend. He did not suggest. He did not frame things carefully to avoid causing alarm. He wrote, plainly and directly, that the Concordat monitoring data showed a human military mobilization on a scale that he did not have adequate language to describe, and that the 90-day deadline they had been given was now 29 days away, and that he believed with more certainty than he had felt about anything in 30 years of diplomatic work that the Grand Council needed to make a decision immediately. His government told him that the Grand Council was reviewing the Bureau's report and would issue a formal response within 2 weeks. 29 days. 2 weeks. Velsoth set his communication terminal down. He looked out the window of his office at the Concordat complex, at the other buildings, at the ships moving in the distance above the atmosphere. He thought about the 2-page document with its ceremonial script title. He thought about the single line at the bottom written in plain common tongue. The clock is running. He had not slept well in several weeks. On day 88, the Concordat sent an automated survey drone to the Kepler staging system, a wide, empty region of space near the coordinates that had once been Kepler's reach. The drone's job was simple. It was to enter the system, run a passive scan, record everything it found, and transmit the data back to the Bureau. The drone entered the system. It ran its passive scan. Its sensors swept the staging area and began recording contacts, ship signatures, energy readings, formation patterns. The contact counter climbed. It kept climbing. The drone's processing system flagged a potential sensor error and ran a diagnostic. The diagnostic confirmed the sensors were functioning correctly. The drone transmitted its data and then, because its memory system was not designed to hold what it had just recorded without issue, it simply stopped processing and waited. Back at the Bureau, the data hit the receiving system. The analyst on duty was a young Thari named Osi, who had been working the overnight monitoring shift for 2 years and who had a reputation for staying calm under pressure. He had seen unusual things come through the receiving system before. He had never in his professional life felt the need to stand up from his chair simply because of a number on a screen. He stood up. He called his supervisor. His supervisor came in, looked at the screen, and called her supervisor. Her supervisor looked at the screen and did not say anything for a long time. 900,000 warships, not patrol craft, not repurposed cargo vessels with weapons bolted on. Warships standardized, uniform, clearly built to a common design, sitting in tight battle group formations, each group with its own carrier, its own logistics shadow, its own support structure, a fleet that had not been assembled in a hurry but had been organized with the care of something that had been planned for a very long time. The Bureau issued an emergency communication to all member governments within the hour. The Veth-Karal Grand Council received it at what was mid-morning in their capital. The council session had been scheduled to discuss trade route adjustments in the outer territories. The emergency communication arrived, and the trade route discussion ended. The room was very quiet for a long time. One council member suggested that the drone's data might be inaccurate. The Bureau confirmed, upon immediate request, that a second drone had been dispatched and had returned identical figures. 900,000. The Grand Council member who had laughed 11 days earlier at the 2-page accounting notice, who had told the chamber that the human response was political theater, that humanity had never fought a major war, that their military capacity on record was insufficient, sat at the council table and did not say anything. Outside, on the Veth-Karal homeworld, Velsoth's family was already in the outer territories. On day 90, Director General Sujin Bey did not send another document. She did not contact the Concordat session chair. She did not issue a statement or hold a press communication or brief the diplomatic community. She boarded a military transport at 0600 and traveled to the Kepler staging system. The ship that received her was called the Times Kepler's Memory. It was the flagship of a fleet that had no historical comparison in the 70 years of humanity's presence in the Concordat. Its captain met her at the docking bay. He was a tall man with a calm face and hands that were entirely steady, and his name was Danyar Saitkali, and he had been a merchant marine captain before he was anything else. And he thought about that sometimes, about the fact that he had spent the first 20 years of his career moving cargo, not weapons, and how that had shaped the way he thought about logistics, about distance, about getting from one point to another without waste. He showed her to the command deck. She stood at the observation viewport for a moment and looked out. She had seen the numbers. She had approved every part of this, piece by piece, over years. She knew what 900,000 warships was supposed to look like. She had not been prepared for what it actually looked like. The fleet filled space the way weather fills space, not in a line, not in a simple grid, but layered and vast, stretching in every direction to the limits of the viewport, ship after ship after ship in formations that had their own internal logic, their own order, enormous and quiet and ready. 900,000 reasons. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned from the viewport and looked at Fleet Admiral Saitkali. "Are we ready?" she asked. He had spent 30 years preparing for a question he hoped would never be asked. He had maintained this fleet, trained its commanders, refined its logistics network, run its simulations. He had done all of it carefully and without complaint, because he understood what it was for not to start something, but to finish it, completely and permanently. If the day ever came that someone forced the issue, the day had come. "We've been ready," he said. Su Jinbei nodded once. She clasped her hands behind her back. She looked out at the fleet one more time, at the 900,000 ships carrying the full weight of what humanity had chosen to be in this moment, and her face was the face she made when a decision had already been made, and what remained was only the work. "Then let's go," she said. The fleet began to move. Ambassador Kethoran of the Saurian Compact had seen a great many things in his long life. He had been born during the last year of his species' third and final civil war, a conflict that had burned across 4 star systems and killed 60 million Saurians before exhaustion and mathematics had finally convinced both sides to stop. He had grown up in the Reconstruction, in cities that were half built and half ruin, learning to read in a school that had no roof for the first 2 years, because the materials for the roof had been diverted to the hospital district. He had watched his species climb out of that wreckage with the slow, grinding dignity of people who have no option but to keep going. He had studied law, then diplomacy, then the specific and delicate art of understanding species that were not his own, their motivations, their fears, the things they said, and the more important things they didn't say. He was now 112 years old by Saurian reckoning, which made him elderly but not ancient, and in those 112 years, he had developed a confidence in his ability to read a situation. He was not arrogant about it. He simply knew what he knew. The way an experienced navigator knows the sea, not perfectly, not infallibly, but well enough to feel it when something was wrong. Something was wrong, or rather something was happening that he did not have the right framework for yet. That was a different feeling, not dread, not fear, the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and not being able to see where it ended. He stood at the observation deck of Saurian Transit Station 7 and watched the human fleet pass through his government's space, and he did not say anything for a very long time. The Saurian Compact had given humanity permission to use their transit corridors 6 weeks earlier. This was not a small thing. The transit corridors were Saurian infrastructure, their lanes, their relay buoys, their fuel stations. Granting passage to a military fleet was a political act with real consequences, and the Saurian Council had debated it at length. Kethoran had argued for granting passage, not because he was certain it was right, but because he had read the accounting document, 2 pages, ceremonial script, 840,000 names plus 1, and he had understood, in the particular way that old diplomats understand things, that the machinery was already in motion, and the only meaningful question was where the Saurian Compact wanted to stand when it finished moving. He had argued for passage and the Council had agreed. And now he stood on the observation deck and watched what that decision had let through. The fleet did not look the way wars looked. That was the thing he kept returning to. He had studied warfare. He had been born in one. He knew what military action felt like from the inside, the heat of it, the noise, the way anger moved through a population like a fever, the commanders who shouted, and the soldiers who shouted back, and the entire enterprise propelled by a kind of collective emotion that was ugly and necessary, and deeply, recognizably alive. This was not that. The human fleet moved in silence. Not the silence of hiding it, was too enormous to hide, and it made no effort to. The silence of a machine that is running correctly. Each of the 47 battle groups held its formation with a precision that was almost uncomfortable to look at directly. The ships spaced with such regularity that they seemed less like individual vessels and more like components of a single, vast object. Supply lines ran between the groups, fuel haulers, ammunition transports, medical frigates moving in their own careful lanes, weaving between the warships without interruption, keeping the whole thing fed and maintained and ready. It was, Keth Oran thought, the most organized thing he had ever seen, and it had been running for weeks. He watched for 3 hours as the fleet passed through. He did not eat. He did not sit. He stood at the viewport with his hands behind his back, watching, and he counted battle groups the way you count things when you are trying to make a large number feel manageable, when you need the act of counting to help you understand something that your mind does not quite want to accept at full size. He reached 47 and stopped. Then he turned and walked to his office and opened a channel to the Times Kepler's memory. Su Jinbei took his call in a small room off the main command deck. She looked the same as she always had in Keth Oran's experience, short gray hair, straight posture, the relaxed expression that was not actually relaxation. He had known her for 12 years. They had worked together on 3 separate Concordat negotiations, and he had a genuine respect for her that was not common in his professional life. He was going to ask her to stop. He knew, even as he opened his mouth, that it was the wrong thing to do. He was going to ask anyway, because it was the thing that needed to be asked, and someone needed to ask it, and he was probably the only person in the galaxy right now who had any chance of being heard. "Sujin," he said, "is this truly necessary?" She looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change. "Keth," she said, "they killed 840,000 people because it was convenient." He had no answer to that. He had known he wouldn't. He asked it anyway because he needed to hear. What she said in response needed the conversation on the record, for his own peace of mind, for his own understanding of what he was allowing to pass through his government's space. "The Concordat can still," he began. "The Concordat," she said, "proposed a committee." Silence. "There are civilians in the Veth Corral systems," he said. "We gave them 90 days to move them." Her voice was not hard. It was not cold. It was the voice of someone who had thought about this every day for 3 months, and had arrived at an answer that cost something to hold. "We were specific. We were clear. What they did with those 90 days is their own choice, and they made it." Keth Oran looked at her through the screen. He had the thought, not for the first time in the past weeks, that he had spent 60 years studying species that were not his own, and had somehow managed to fundamentally misread this one. Not the direction of them. He had always known humanity was capable of violence, the way every species was capable of violence. What he had missed was the depth of the infrastructure behind it, the patience of it, the way they had maintained their capacity for exactly this, quietly and without announcement, for longer than most civilizations maintained anything. "I need you to know," he said, "that I will remember this conversation." "So will I," she said. She thanked him for the transit corridor access. She cut the channel. Keth Oran sat in his office. Through the wall, he could feel more than hear the continued movement of the fleet, a faint vibration in the station structure, the kind that came from massive engines passing close by in large numbers. It had been going on for hours. It would continue for hours more. He thought about what he had just seen, and what it meant for the shape of the galaxy going forward. Then he went back to the observation deck. He needed to keep watching. He was not sure why, exactly. There was nothing practical in it, but there was something important about bearing witness to things that were going to change the world. Even when, especially when what you were watching was difficult. Fleet Admiral Daniyar Saitkali ran his command from a chair that was slightly too big for him. He had not ordered a replacement because the chair had come with the times Kepler's memory times when she was commissioned, and he had a mild superstition about changing things on a ship that was running well. The chair was fine. He simply sat slightly forward in it, which gave him the appearance of constant mild attention, which was accurate. He was 64 years old. His face was broad and weathered. He had the kind of hands that belonged to someone who had spent decades actually working large, slightly scarred across the knuckles from a cargo loading accident 20 years back. Always steady. When he spoke quietly. This was not a performance. He was simply a man who had found, over a long life, that quiet speech made people lean in and listen, which was more useful than loud speech, which made people flinch and miss half of what was said. His staff did not shout on the times Kepler's memory. They had taken that from him without being told. The command deck ran on the same principle as the fleet itself, methodical, clean, each person doing their specific job in the specific order it needed to be done. Psychology reviewed reports the way other people drank water constantly, without drama, absorbing information, and adjusting. 3 screens in front of him showed the fleet's real-time status, fuel consumption across all 47 battle groups, maintenance flags from individual ships, supply line movement, formation integrity. He watched all 3 simultaneously. It had taken years to learn to do this. Now, it felt like breathing. His senior tactical officer, Commander Lena Vass, had served with him for 8 years. She was 37, precise, and had a habit of solving problems before he asked about them. He valued this above most things in a colleague. She was at her station to his right, working through the approach logistics for the Veth Corral border system. Fleet status, he said. All 47 groups green, she said. Fuel lines holding. Medical ships report no issues. Supply consumption is running 4% under projection. He nodded. 4% under was good. It meant his captains were managing their ships well, not burning fuel on unnecessary maneuvers. 900,000 ships and 4% under projection. He made a mental note to include that in the logistics report. Border system ETA? He asked. 31 hours. He nodded again. He looked at his screens. Then he did something that surprised the younger officers on the command deck who had not served with him before. He leaned back in his too large chair, folded his hands in his lap, and closed his eyes. He was not sleeping. He was thinking. He did this sometimes, just sat with the weight of what he was doing, holding it in his mind plainly and without flinching, because he believed that commanders who refused to look directly at what they were doing made worse decisions than ones who looked at it clearly. What he was doing was taking 900,000 ships to fight a species that had killed 840,000 of his people because it had been convenient. He was going to do it as cleanly and as precisely as it could be done. He was going to minimize every loss that could be minimized. He was going to follow the plan that had been built over months of exhaustive preparation, because the plan was good and because deviation from good plans in the field usually came from emotion, and he had long ago learned to use his emotions as information rather than instructions. He was going to do his job. He thought about Yara Ose for a moment, thought about her 18 minutes, her steady voice, the data packet she had pushed through with 40 seconds to spare. He thought about the 1,108 people who had made it off Kepler's reach aboard the Times Inelegant Persistence Times, and who were now scattered across 8 different settlements, living in temporary housing, adjusting to lives that had been completely destroyed and rebuilt in the space of one night. He opened his eyes. "Lena," he said. "Sir, get me the names of all 14 captains whose ships are reporting the highest fuel efficiency across the fleet right now. I want to send them a note." She looked at him for a fraction of a second, long enough for him to see that she was surprised, and then she turned to her console. "Yes, sir." This was the thing that newer officers on his crew found hardest to understand about him. In the middle of preparing to take 900,000 warships into battle, he stopped to write notes. He wrote them to individual ship captains. He wrote them to logistics coordinators who had solved a particular supply problem efficiently. He wrote them to the medical officer who had filed an exceptionally thorough readiness report. He wrote short, specific notes that said exactly what the person had done right and why it mattered. He had been doing this his entire career. His reasoning was simple. Large things were made of small things. A fleet of 900,000 ships was made of 900,000 crews, and each crew was made of individual people, and individual people did their best work when they understood that someone was paying attention, not to the fleet as a number, to them, specifically, and the specific things they did right. He wrote 14 notes. It took 11 minutes. Then he went back to his screens and his reports, and the 31 hours between the fleet and what came next. Across the Concordat, in the days after the fleet's passage through Saurian space, a certain quality of silence had settled over the diplomatic community. It was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of people who have just realized, simultaneously, that they have made a significant error in how they understood something, and who are now privately reassessing everything they thought they knew, while publicly saying very little. The error was not complicated. It was simply this. For 61 years, the Concordat had looked at humanity and seen a quiet species, a productive species, a species that kept to itself, that colonized the dead rocks nobody wanted, that showed up to Concordat sessions and voted sensibly and did not cause trouble. A species that had been in the galaxy for 6 decades without fighting a war. A species that, by every observable measure, seemed to have no interest in being dangerous. The Concordat had looked at all of that and concluded that humanity was not dangerous. What they had not considered, what none of them had thought to ask, was whether the absence of war was the result of inability or of choice, whether a species that had never fought a war among the stars was one that couldn't, or one that simply hadn't yet found a reason. In offices and council chambers across the Concordat, analysts were now pulling up 61 years of human activity and reading it again from the beginning, looking for what they had missed. The fabrication rings that had been assumed to be civilian infrastructure. The fuel depot networks running along corridors that made more sense for military logistics than for trade. The storage facilities parked at stable orbital points around uninhabited moons, listed as reserve materiel, never inspected because nobody had thought to ask. All of it had been there. All of it had been visible, technically, if you had been looking. Nobody had been looking. Kethoran, back in his office after his second hour on the observation deck, pulled up his own archived files on humanity. 30 years of assessments, contact reports, diplomatic summaries. He read them carefully, looking for the place where the understanding had gone wrong. He found it quickly. His own assessment, filed 22 years ago, which had been shared across the Concordat intelligence network and had formed part of the basis for the standard evaluation of humanity. It was thorough and well argued, and it said, in precise diplomatic language, that humanity was a mid-tier species with moderate industrial capacity, no significant military history, and a strong institutional preference for peaceful resolution of disputes. The assessment was accurate. It was also, he now understood, completely wrong in the most important way possible. Not wrong about the facts it stated, wrong about what those facts meant. He had looked at humanity's preference for peace and had understood it as a fixed property of their nature. The way a boulder is heavy, or water is wet. He had not understood it as a choice that, when something bad enough happened, could be unmade. He closed the file. He picked up his comm and connected to his homeworld. His aide answered. I need the council available within the hour, Kethoran said. All members. Is there an emergency, Ambassador? He thought about the fleet that had passed through Saurian space for 3 hours, 47 battle groups, 900,000 ships, running 4% under fuel projection, moving with the quiet precision of something that had been planned and maintained and waiting for a very long time. He thought about Su Jinbei's face on the screen, the way she had looked when she said times what they did with those 90 days is their own choice. Not an emergency, he said. A conversation we should have had a long time ago. He paused. Pull everything we have on human history, military history specifically, economics, industrial development. Go back as far as the records go. His aide was quiet for a moment. That's quite a broad request, Ambassador. Is there something in particular you're looking for? Kethoran looked out his office window at the now empty transit corridor, at the space where 900,000 warships had been and were no longer. I want to understand, he said quietly, how we spent 61 years living next to something like that and never once thought to ask what it was for. He closed the channel. Outside, the transit corridor was still and dark and empty. The fleet was already gone. It would not be gone much longer. The Veth-Karal border fleet was in the middle of a routine patrol rotation when the first human battle group dropped out of fold space. The patrol commander, a veteran officer named Teth Vaughn, who had served the Veth-Karal Navy for 38 years, saw the contacts appear on his sensor array and felt something that he later described in the debrief that he did not expect to survive long enough to give as the particular horror of a number that does not make sense. His sensor array was showing him 19,000 contacts. His brain kept telling him the array was wrong. He ran a diagnostic. The diagnostic told him the array was working correctly. 19,000 warships. That was Battle Group 7. One of 47. He did not have time to finish the thought. The human fleet was already moving. The Veth-Karal border fleet fought. This was important to understand and easy to overlook later, when people talked about what happened at Veth-Heran. It was easy, in retrospect, to talk about the numbers 6,000 against 19,000. The math so lopsided it seemed like it shouldn't qualify as a battle. It was easy to make it sound simple. It was not simple. The Veth-Karal were a species that had been building warships for 400 years. Their weapons were old designs, but they were good old designs, refined by centuries of use. Their armor was dense and layered in a way that human weapons took time to work through. Their formation discipline was excellent. When the attack came, they did not scatter. They held. They returned fire with everything they had. They lost ships, and they kept fighting. For every Veth-Karal ship that the humans destroyed, they destroyed 3 human ships first. 3-to-1 was not a good exchange rate for the Veth-Karal. 3-to-1 meant they would run out of ships long before Battle Group 7 did. But it was enough to make it clear that what was happening at Veth-Heran was not a slaughter. It was a fight. The Veth-Karal Navy knew how to fight. They simply did not have enough of anything that mattered. On the Times Kepler's memory, Saitkali watched the Veth-Heran battle unfold on his screens in real time. The numbers updated constantly: ship losses, position changes, energy weapon exchanges, missile volleys, the endless moving arithmetic of a large engagement. He watched 3 human ships go dark in a single minute when a Veth-Karal cruiser found a gap in a formation and hit it perfectly. He noted it. He made a correction to the tactical guidance he sent to Battle Group 7's commander. He did not stop watching. Commander Lena Vass looked at the exchange rate and said, carefully, "We're losing 3 ships for every one of theirs." "I know," Saitkali said. "A pause. That's acceptable at current fleet scale," he said. "Run the numbers forward. At 3-to-1 losses, we lose Battle Group 7 completely in 11 hours, she said. "Before we've run out of ships to replace it with?" She checked. "We could cycle 4 full replacement groups through Veth-Heran and still retain 2/3 of overall fleet capacity." He nodded. "Then the exchange rate is acceptable." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, sir." He knew what she was doing with that silence. He let it sit. She was right to feel it. Every ship that went dark in those numbers was a crew of 40 to 200 people. 3 ships lost for every 1 enemy ship was not a statistic. It was a stack of names. He knew this. He held it the same way he held everything, plainly, without looking away, as information that he was responsible for. The Veth-Karal border fleet was destroyed in 9 hours and 14 minutes. Teth Vaughn survived. 43% of his crews did not. What the Veth-Karal High Command did not understand, what they were still trying to understand, in the frantic hours after Veth-Heran, was that Battle Group 7 was not the main event. It was not even close to the main event. While Battle Group 7 engaged the border fleet at Veth-Heran, 46 other battle groups dropped out of fold space simultaneously across every system in Veth-Karal territory. Not sequentially, not in waves. All of them, at the same moment, coordinated across distances that required months of logistical planning to make possible. Each battle group hit a different target: mining stations, shipyards, fuel depots, weapons manufacturing platforms, fortress installations, communications relays. Every piece of infrastructure that the Veth-Karal military used to function was being hit, at the same time, by a force large enough that the local defenders could not call for reinforcement because every local defender was already fully engaged. The Veth-Karal Grand Fleet, their central force, their strongest ships, their most experienced commanders scrambled to respond. They split their forces to cover the most critical installations. It was the correct decision. It was also exactly what the human campaign plan had predicted they would do. The moment the Grand Fleet split, The second wave of human battle groups, the Reserve, which was larger than the entire Vethkaral military, entered the areas that the Grand Fleet had just vacated. In the Concordat Intelligence Sharing Bureau, analysts watching the real-time tactical feeds went very quiet. One of them, a young Thari named Osi, the same analyst who had stood up from his chair when the drone data came back, was assigned to the overnight monitoring shift on day 1 of the campaign. He watched the battle map update for 6 hours. By the end of his shift, the map was covered in human fleet markers, spread across the entirety of Vethkaral space like something that had been growing quietly underwater and had chosen this moment to surface all at once. He went home at the end of his shift and sat in his kitchen and thought about the 63-page bureau report he had read 3 weeks ago, the one that had shown 900,000 warships in the Kepler staging system. He had read that report and thought he understood the scale of what he was reading. He had not understood it. He understood it now. The cost was real. This was the part that got lost sometimes, in the way that stories about large events tend to smooth over the texture of what actually happened. The numbers were very large, and when numbers are very large, each one stops feeling like a person. Saitkali did not allow this on the Times Kepler's memory. Every ship lost in the campaign was logged by name. Every crew member on every lost ship was entered into the memorial record within 12 hours of the ship going dark, if identification was possible, and flagged for follow-up if it was not. The memorial record was a live document, updated continuously, accessible on every screen on the flagship. Saitkali had ordered it placed there on day 1. He had not explained why. His staff had understood. Over the 14 days of the campaign, 14,003 human warships were destroyed. 2,341,000 sailors. Each name took approximately 1 second to read aloud. Reading all of them without stopping would take 27 days. Saitkali signed every page of the memorial record himself. His signature at the bottom of each page was not ceremonial. It was a statement of responsibility. These people had followed his orders, and his orders had placed them where they died, and he was going to put his name to that fact every single time, for as long as it took. He slept 4 hours a night during the campaign. His staff tried, twice, to suggest he sleep more. He thanked them and did not change his schedule. He also kept writing notes. In the middle of the largest military campaign in human history, he kept writing notes to individual ship captains and logistics officers and medical coordinators who had done something specific and right. His aide, a 26-year-old named Prita, who had expected the job to involve scheduling and document management and had received something considerably more than that, quietly tracked the notes and confirmed they were being received. They were. Every single one. Several captains later said that receiving one of Saitkali's notes during the campaign was the thing that made them feel like what they were doing was visible, like someone at the center of an incomprehensibly large operation had somehow found them, specifically, and seen them. This was exactly what he intended. Grand Admiral Vethsaran had commanded the Vethkaral military for 40 years. She had been born into one of the Empire's oldest military families. She had graduated first in her class from the War Academy. She had fought in 2 border engagements with neighboring species, won both of them, and built the Border Fleet Reinforcement Program that had added 2,000 ships to the frontier defense over the past decade. She was considered by her peers to be one of the finest military minds the Vethkaral had produced in a generation. She sat in her command station on day 9 of the campaign and looked at the casualty reports from all 14 systems simultaneously. The reports kept coming in. They had been coming in for 9 days without pause. Each one was a number, and then another number, and then a location, and then a list of what had been lost. Ships, installations, the fuel depot at Kara 7 irreplaceable, 10 years to rebuild. The primary shipyard at Vetharan, the largest in the Empire, gone in 4 hours. The communications relay network disrupted across 6 systems. Partial functionality restored in 2. The other 4 still dark. The humans were not using their full fleet. That was the thing that she could not stop thinking about. 9 days in, with 14,000 systems either damaged or destroyed, and her military running out of the ability to respond coherently, and the human fleet reserve still had not moved from its secondary staging position. They had enough left to start over and do this again from the beginning. She had run the numbers herself, 3 times, because she did not trust anyone else to run them without the result affecting their ability to function. She needed to know it clearly, and she needed to know it alone, first. before she decided what to do with the information. The numbers were not complicated. They were simply impossible. She had spent 40 years in the Vethkaral military. She had studied every conflict her species had ever been involved in. She had read the records of wars won and wars lost and wars that had ended in exhausted draws. And in all of that reading, she had developed a clear sense of what defeat looked like at the strategic level, the shape of it, the point at which continuing cost more than stopping. She had reached that point. She opened a direct channel to the human fleet flagship. The transmission came through on the times Kepler's memory times at 0340, when most of the command deck was running on night shift staffing. The night communications officer patched it through to Saitkali's quarters immediately. Per standing orders. Saitkali was awake. He was always awake at 0340. He read the translation of Vethsaran's message twice. It was formal and correct, the proper military language for a request to discuss terms of cessation. Professional. She had written it the way someone writes something they would rather not write but are going to write correctly. He set the message down. He sat in his chair in his quarters for a while. The ship hummed around him, the sound of everything running. 900,000 ships maintaining their positions and their patrols and their logistics chains in the dark. He thought about what accepting terms meant, what it would look like, what it would require. He had a plan for that too, not because he had been certain it would reach this point, but because he had planned for every outcome. The way you plan for everything when the scale of what you are doing means that being surprised is unacceptable. He pressed the intercom. "Get me comms," he said. His night comms officer answered immediately. Her name was Specialist Adaize Naji, and she had been on shift for 4 hours and would be on shift for 4 more. "Specialist," he said, "I need you to find something in the archive for me." Before the fleet departed the Kepler staging system, I had a specific file transferred to the flagship's records. A personal file, not a tactical document. It was logged under the designation KR Primary 1. A pause while she searched. "Found it, sir. Play it for me." Through the command deck speakers. Another pause, shorter. "Sir, the command deck?" "The command deck," he said. He got up from his chair. He put his uniform on. He walked to the command deck, which was running on reduced night shift staff, 8 people at their stations, doing the quiet work of maintaining the fleet through the dark hours. They looked up when he entered. He went to his chair and sat in it. "Sir," said Specialist Naji through the speakers. "File KR Primary 1. Ready. Play it," he said. The command deck was quiet. And then, through the speakers, a 9-year-old girl's voice filled the room. "Hi, Grandma. It's me. I made you something. I know you said you miss horses more than anything, so I drew one for you." A small pause, the sound of paper moving. "I made the tail too long, but I think it looks nice anyway." She kept talking. She talked about her school, about a friend named Yemi who was very funny, about the tomatoes they were growing in the greenhouse district and how she was allowed to pick one if it turned red all the way around. She talked about the cold, about how it came through the walls at night, even in summer, about how her mother put an extra blanket on her bed and it helped. She talked for 1 minute and 43 seconds. Then the transmission cut. The command deck was completely silent. Kelly sat in his chair. He looked at his screens. 8 officers at their stations did not move. He let the silence last for a moment. Then he said, in his quiet voice that made people lean in, "Specialist Naji, sir, please open a channel to Grand Admiral Vethsaran." "Open, sir." He straightened in his chair. "Grand Admiral," he said, "I have received your transmission. I am prepared to discuss the terms of cessation. I want to be clear, before we begin, that the human government is not interested in your government's destruction. We are interested in something more specific." A pause across the channel. Then Vethsaran's voice, translated, "Careful." "And what is that?" He looked at his screens. At the memorial record, still updating, still accumulating names. At the battle map showing the entirety of Vethkaral space, covered in human fleet markers. "Understanding," he said. "We want your government to understand completely, with nothing left out what it chose when it sent 12 ships to Kepler's reach. We want that understanding to last. We are going to take some time to make sure it does." He paused. "After that," he said, "we will discuss terms." He did not close the channel. He kept it open, so that Vethsaran could hear what happened next. He nodded to Specialist Naji. She played the file again. The girl's voice came back into the room. "Hi, Grandma. It's me." Outside, in the dark between stars, the fleet held its positions, patient and enormous and burning, steady as a heartbeat, waiting. The terms were not what Grand Admiral Veth Saran expected. She had prepared for demands that matched the shape of the campaign, territorial concessions perhaps, massive financial reparations, the formal dissolution of the border fleet, possibly the removal of the Grand Council entirely and the installation of a client government. These were the things that victorious powers traditionally demanded. In her experience, these were the levers that winning species pulled. Fleet Admiral Saitkali pulled none of them. He sent her a document on the morning after their first channel exchange. It was, like the original accounting notice, very short. 4 pages. She read it 3 times in the same way that Velsoth had read the accounting notice slowly, looking for the part she was missing, the hidden demand inside the plain language. There was no hidden demand. The document said that the human government required 3 things. First, every Vethkaral military installation across all 14 systems, every shipyard, every weapons platform, every fortress, every fuel depot built to military specification, every orbital defense station was to be dismantled, not destroyed, dismantled, piece by piece, under human supervision, with full documentation of every component removed. The process would take years. Human inspection teams would be present throughout. The Vethkaral civilian economy was not to be touched. Their trade infrastructure, their homes, their food production, their hospitals untouched, completely, in every system. Second, the Vethkaral government was to fund, in full, the construction of a memorial at the coordinates of Kepler's Reach. The design specifications were attached. The memorial was to be completed within 3 years. Human engineers would oversee the construction. Third, every member of the Vethkaral Grand Council that had approved the action at Kepler's Reach was to be removed from government permanently. Not imprisoned, not executed, simply removed. 1. Forbidden from holding any position of governmental authority for the remainder of their lives. That was all. Veth Saran read it a 4th time. She had spent 40 years studying military history. She knew what victorious powers did. She knew the patterns, the crushing terms designed to cripple, the reparations set so high that the losing species would spend generations paying them, the territorial seizures, the installed governments, the deliberate humiliation built into the language of the treaty itself. The human document had none of that. It was, she thought, almost restrained. Almost. And then she understood it. Destruction was permanent but finite. You could recover from being destroyed. History was full of civilizations that had been broken and had rebuilt, but to be dismantled carefully, completely, watched the entire time and then left, standing, intact, alive, and times permanently unable to arm yourself again, times that was something different. That was a lesson written into the infrastructure of a civilization at the deepest possible level. Every Vethkaral child born after this day would grow up on a world that could not defend itself. Every generation that followed would know why, would know what their grandparents' government had done to earn it, would live, every day, inside the consequence. She signed the document. Her hand did not shake. She was a military officer, and she had never allowed her hands to shake in the presence of witnesses. She signed it and sent it back, and then she sat alone in her command station for a long time, and she thought about 12 ships sent to a colony that had no weapons, and about a 4-hour bombardment, and about the single line in her predecessor's log. Discouragement. Action. She thought about what a species had to decide to become, quietly and over decades, to answer a discouragement action with 900,000 warships. She did not have an answer. She was not sure one existed. The Galactic Concordat convened its first full session after the campaign on a Tuesday morning, local station time. Every seat was filled. The room had the quality that large rooms get when everyone in them is trying very hard to look composed and is not entirely succeeding. The Vethkaral seat was occupied by a junior diplomat named Keth Vine, young, inexperienced, clearly terrified, clearly doing his best. Velsoth had resigned his position the week before. His letter of resignation said only that he had served long enough and that it was time for new voices. It said nothing else. Nobody who knew him believed this was the full reason, and nobody asked him for clarification. 17 species had issued statements in the weeks following the campaign. The statements were, without exception, carefully worded. They expressed a commitment to peace. They affirmed the importance of the Concordat's founding principles. They noted the seriousness of the events at Kepler's Reach and the significance of what had followed. They did not, notably, criticize the human response. Not even obliquely, not even in the careful diplomatic language that could be read multiple ways, depending on who was reading it. The committee that had been proposed after Kepler's Reach had quietly ceased to meet. When Director General Su Jin-bei rose to speak, the room was very still. She stood at the human delegation's table. She wore the same gray suit she wore to every session. Her posture was the same as it always was, straight, unhurried, occupying her space without apology. She thanked the Concordat members for their presence. She thanked the species that had offered humanitarian support to displaced survivors of Kepler's Reach. Several had, quietly and genuinely, and she named each of them and the specific support they had provided, because specificity was a form of respect. She said that the human government remained committed to the Concordat's founding principles, that humanity had not entered the Concordat 61 years ago to fight wars, that they had entered it to build something, trade, cooperation, the slow and difficult accumulation of trust between species that had no natural reason to trust each other. She said that they remained committed to that project. Then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was the same quiet register, but carrying something underneath it that made the room stay completely still. She said that the human government's fleet had been returned to its staging positions, not decommissioned, staged, maintained, fueled and crewed and ready, for as long as it seemed prudent for it to be ready. She said that humanity hoped, genuinely and without condition, that it would never need to move from those positions again. She looked around the room. "We did not want this," she said. "We did not choose it. We were given it by a government that looked at 840,000 of our people and decided they were convenient to remove." She picked up her folder. "We want to be clear about what happened," she said, "not as a threat, as information. We think it is important that everyone in this room has accurate information." She set the folder down and looked up. "We were here," she said. "We were quiet. We were cooperative and productive, and we did not cause trouble for 61 years. And we were here all along." She sat down. No one spoke for a moment. Then the session chair, a Thari elder named Goth-san, who had run Concordat sessions for 20 years, cleared his throat and called the agenda. The agenda moved forward. But the room had changed. Something in the air of it, the careful balance of assumed powers and assumed limits, had shifted. Quietly and permanently, like a door that has been closed for a long time, opening onto a view that nobody had known was there. The memorial took 2 years and 8 months to complete. It stood at the coordinates of Kepler's Reach, not on a surface, because there was no surface left, but in space itself, a structure of dark stone and light anchored at the orbital position where the colony had been. The stone was Absalom stone, retrieved from the debris field over 18 months of salvage operations. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, the teams had worked through the debris. They had found other things, too, in that debris. Small things, a child's shoe, the frame of a folding table, a data pad, still partially functional, that contained 43 unfinished detective novels. These were cataloged and preserved and placed in a separate archive, because someone had decided, and no one ever found out who decided this first. It seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously that they should be kept. The memorial's outer face held 840,000 names. They were arranged not alphabetically, not chronologically, but in neighborhood clusters the way the colony had been organized in life, district by district, block by block, so that families were near each other, so that neighbors were near each other, so that the school's 847 children were listed together in the section marked for the school district, and Obasi's name was among them because he had spent his last minutes calling every family he had a record for. And whatever section you put a man like that in, it should be the one where the children are. Dr. Patel was in the hospital district. Hessa was in the market district, and somewhere near her name, if you looked, was a small engraving that had not been in the original design specifications, and that nobody admitted to having added a pair of gloves, rendered in precise detail in the stone. The first name on the memorial was not listed alphabetically. It was not the first person to die. It was placed first by a decision that Sujin Bey had made personally, without consulting anyone, because she was the Director General, and some decisions were hers to make alone. The first name was Yara Ose, commander of the Times in elegant persistence, owner of a cargo hauler she had loved for 11 years, the woman who had loaded 1,108 people onto a ship built for cargo and run for 18 minutes, with a Veth Karal intercept closing behind her, and who had spent every one of those 18 minutes doing the most useful thing she could do with the time she had. She had not been trying to be remembered. She had been trying to make sure the data got through. The data had gotten through. The 1,108 people she had carried off Kepler's Reach were scattered across 8 settlements now. Some of them had moved on, new homes, new jobs, the difficult ongoing work of building a life on top of the wreckage of the previous one. Some of them were still in temporary housing. A few had gone back to work in space, on cargo routes, because it was what they knew, and the alternative was to let what had happened take that from them too. And they had decided not to let it. All 1,108 of them had been asked, through a quiet government program, if they wanted to attend the memorial's opening. All 1,108 said yes. They stood together, in the observation bay of the station that had been built adjacent to the memorial, and they looked at the structure floating in the space where their home had been. Nobody spoke much. There was not much to say. The stone was dark and enormous and covered in names, and it floated against the stars, and it was made of pieces of the place they had come from, and that was something. A woman near the back of the group, small, gray-haired now, someone who had been on the Times inelegant persistence times because she had been working a maintenance shift at the secondary port when the alarm went off, and had looked at the first name on the memorial for a long time. She had known Yara Ose. Not well. Well enough to recognize her on the dock, well enough to have shared a coffee twice in the port's break room, well enough to have watched her work a console and understood, even without knowing her well, that she was someone who knew exactly what she was doing and did it without wasting anything. She looked at Yara Ose's name for a long time. Then she nodded, once, to herself. Then she looked at the rest of the names and let herself feel the full size of what she was looking at. The Concordat Diplomatic Academy occupied a large building on the Concordat Central Station. It trained the next generation of diplomats from every member species, young people who had chosen the particular and demanding work of trying to understand people who were not like them, and to build things between different worlds that could last. Kethoran had been asked to give a lecture there. He had been asked many times over the years, since his retirement, and he had declined most of them. He was old now, and he had grown particular about how he spent his time. But this request was different. This one was for the first-year class, the newest students, the ones who had just arrived, and the topic was one that he had been thinking about for years. And he said yes. He stood at the front of a room of young faces, Thari and Sorian and Dur, and a dozen others, and 2 humans in the back row, who watched him with the particular careful attention that humans brought to things that were about them. He stood without notes, because he had been thinking about this for long enough that he did not need them. He talked about Kepler's Reach. He talked about the campaign. He talked about standing on the observation deck of Transit Station 7 and watching the fleet pass for 3 hours, and about the feeling he had had that he did not have a word for the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large. He talked about his conversation with Sujin Bey. He talked about reading his own archived assessment, 22 years old, thorough, well-argued, completely wrong in the way that mattered most. Then he stopped talking and looked at his students for a moment. "I want to tell you the mistake," he said. "The specific one, because it is a mistake that is easy to make, and you are going to be in positions where making it has consequences." The room was quiet. "I looked at 61 years of human peace," he said, "and I understood it as a property, the way a rock is heavy, something fixed in their nature that would not change." He paused. "It was a choice," he said. "It had always been a choice. Every year of those 61 years they chose it. And, like any choice, it could be unmade, if someone gave them sufficient reason." He looked at the 2 humans in the back row. They were watching him steadily. "The Veth Corral gave them sufficient reason," he said. "And what we discovered, what all of us in the Concordat discovered, too late to be useful, was that a species which has chosen peace for 61 years, and maintained that choice, while building what they built, is not a peaceful species in the way we had assumed. It is a species with very long patience and a very clear sense of what that patience is worth. He let that sit for a moment. The lesson is not about humans specifically, he said. The lesson is about what you do not see when you look at a quiet neighbor and decide that quiet means harmless. Quiet means many things. You have to learn to ask which one. A student near the front, a young Saurian, earnest-looking, the kind who would ask the question others were thinking, raised a hand. Ambassador, do you think what humanity did was right? Ketharan looked at him. I think 840,000 people were killed because a government decided they were inconvenient, he said. I think humanity answered that in the most complete way they could. I think the answer cost them 2,341,000 sailors and 14,000 ships, and a thing that cannot be measured, the knowledge of what they are capable of, which they now have to live with. He paused. Whether it was right, he said, is a question I am still thinking about. I expect I will be thinking about it for the rest of my life. That is appropriate. Questions that size should take a long time to answer. He picked up his folder from the lectern. That, he said, is what I came to tell you. Large things take time. Quiet neighbors deserve careful attention. And the most important information about any species is rarely in what they have done. He looked out at the room. It is in what they have chosen not to do yet. He thanked them for their time. He walked out of the lecture hall and into the corridor, moving with the careful pace of a very old man who still covered ground efficiently. His aide was waiting with his coat. He put it on. He walked toward the exit, through the station's observation windows. As he passed, he could see the traffic of the Concordat Central Hub ships of 34 species moving in their lanes, cargo and passengers and diplomatic vessels and trade convoys, the whole slow machinery of a civilization that was, despite everything, still working, still building, still trying. Among them, unremarkable, a human cargo hauler was making its approach to the docking ring. It was large and ungraceful and clearly built for function over form. Its running lights blinked steadily in the dark. Ketharan watched it for a moment. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and walked on. On a Tuesday morning, in an apartment in a city on Earth, an old woman sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened her morning messages. She was 81 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands shook a little, the way hands do at 81, but not so much that she couldn't manage a cup of tea or navigate her message terminal without trouble. She lived alone, and she liked it that way. Her neighbor came by on Wednesdays to check on her, which she also liked, though she would not have said so out loud. The message queue had the usual things: a note from her son on Mars, checking in, a reminder from her medical provider, a message from the community board about something to do with the building's heating system, which she set aside to read later. And then, at the bottom of the queue, flagged with a small government archive symbol, was a message she did not recognize. She opened it. It was from the Memorial Records Office, Kepler's Reach. It said, in plain and gentle language, that in the process of compiling and preserving communication records from Kepler's Reach for the Memorial Archive, the office had recovered a number of personal transmissions that had been in the colony's communication queue at the time of the attack. These transmissions had been recovered from relay buoy backups. They were being delivered, where possible, to the intended recipients. The message said that attached was a personal transmission addressed to her. The sender was listed as Sana, her granddaughter. Her hands were shaking more than usual when she pressed play. She set her tea down because she did not trust herself to hold it. The screen lit up. A small girl in yellow-starred pajamas looked back at her. She was holding up a drawing of a horse with a tail that was slightly too long. Her face was bright and completely alive, and she was smiling the particular smile of someone who has made something and is proud of it. Hi, Grandma, Sana said. It's me. I made you something. The old woman pressed her hand to her mouth. I know you said you miss horses more than anything, so I drew one for you. I made the tail too long, but I think it looks nice anyway. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday. Trams ran. People walked. The sky was the particular pale blue of early morning, before the sun had gotten high enough to warm it. Inside the apartment, for 1 minute and 43 seconds, a child's voice filled the room. The old woman listened to every word. When it ended, She sat very still for a long time. Then, she saved the file to every backup she had. Then she printed the drawing of the horse, the one with the tail that was too long, and she held it in her hands. And she looked at it, and she let herself feel the full size of what had been kept for her across years and wreckage, and the vast distance between what had happened and this quiet Tuesday morning. She put it on the wall above her kitchen table, where she would see it every day. Outside, the city kept moving. The sky kept brightening. The morning went on.